Alright, well there we go. We've got the Chinese Navy front and center here. And this stack of Chinese naval units also includes the amphibiously moving Chinese land units for the purposes of conducting their invasion. And recall, the Chinese fleet's going to sail around this way, and we're going to make a landing up there. In all truthfulness, this is kind of a daring attempt, and I don't mean daring in the good way. This is on par with something like Incheon during the Korean War. It's pretty risky, but this is only a tutorial, so I figured we'll kind of go out on a limb here. All right, so this is going to start the Japanese player turn. We've already finished up the Chinese player turn, and we're going to conduct the Japanese strike phase. Okay, well, we've got a couple missile units here, and we could launch those during the strike phase, but you'll notice immediately that these missile units with a range of 3 can't quite make it to the Chinese stack. So they're not going to be able to be fired. And of course we've got a Japanese naval flotilla in here with a anti-ship missile. It only has a range of 1, so they're not going to be able to fire. Now, during the Japanese movement phase, it's very likely that these Japanese naval flotillas are going to come on out and try to engage the Chinese stack there, but for now they cannot fire their missiles because they're simply out of range. During the Chinese player's turn, if the Chinese player decides to move his stack of naval units along this way, he will enter within the range of these Japanese surface-to-surface missile units, and when you do that, the opposing player can always declare a temporary halt of a moving naval unit or stack and declare a missile strike. So, but alright, there's not going to be any missile strikes, and note that the Japanese, they don't have anything on par with the Chinese hyperglide vehicles. They don't have anything with that kind of range or anything like that, so there's not going to be any missile strikes. But the Japanese do have some air units, and they're going to go ahead and launch those. Now, they've lost a fair amount of air units to those commando missions during the first turn, you'll recall, during the Chinese turn, but they still got quite a bit, and so we can see a couple here, and the Japanese player, that's me, is going to launch these 2 air units to conduct a strike on the Chinese fleet here. Okay, well, there are interception rules in the game. Every air unit has a interception range of 6 hexes. This is based on the maximum radar coverage of a modern aircraft's nose radar array, and there's a die roll involved depending on how far away the enemy air unit is that you want to intercept, but none of that's relevant here because there are no Chinese air units around. Once the Chinese make a landing, in theory, and the Chinese start basing some air units in some of the locations that they've captured, then you could see some air interceptions happen and stuff like that. But right now that's not an issue, so the Japanese air units can simply fly right into the target to conduct their strike. Now, in spite of the fact that there are no Chinese air units around to intercept this Japanese flight en route to the stack, in an engagement hex you can always conduct an interception. That's always automatic, and of course this represents the fact that there's probably Chinese air units here flying top cover for this fleet and things like that. So let's take a look at the Chinese Air Force. We can see it there. Alright, well, the Chinese have 1 4-quality air unit, and this represents what few 5th generation fighters they have, so the Chinese can fly that in. They can fly any of these in, up to 2 air units. 2 air units is the maximum that you can fly to an engagement hex. But we've only got 1 of these 4-quality air units, so yeah, we're going to go ahead and fly the 1 4-quality air unit that we have, and we're going to pick up 1 of our 3-quality air units. And of course these are all based off map, and there are no range limits in the game. At this game scale, in view of the fact that modern air units have aerial refueling and they just have a pretty good range, range limits aren't a factor. Air units can pretty much get anywhere they want. Theoretically, there would be some limits if you tried to fly the entire length of the map, but insofar as that's probably never going to happen, And also we're assuming that a lot of these Chinese air units are based in Chinese-occupied Korea, South Korea. Range is just simply not an issue, so it was easier to do away with any rules regarding range. All right, okay, so we've got 2 Chinese air units that are eligible to automatically intercept in the engagement hex itself. And this, by the way, applies to land combat as well. If you've got a land combat going on, for instance, let's say these 2 Chinese units are going to attack this artillery battalion, and the Chinese fly in some air units. Well, the Japanese can fly in air units to that hex automatically. They don't have to worry about interception ranges or anything like that. So, alright, we've got 2 Japanese air units in there, and we've got 2 Chinese air units in there. Guess what happens next? We're going to resolve air combat. So, how does air combat work? Alright, well, we've got 2 air units for each side, and what that means is that the Japanese player is eligible to roll 1 6-sided die per air unit that's capable of air combat. You don't roll for helicopters, for instance, if helicopters are involved. So the Japanese player can roll 2 dice, and the Chinese player can roll 2 dice. So let's get those out. Get some dice for the Chinese, some dice for the Japanese. And what you're looking for is the highest die roll. Highest die roll wins air combat. However, after you roll the die or dice, you add the air unit's quality rating to your own die or dice roll. So the better air unit, the more chances you have for actually prevailing in air combat. So the Japanese are going to roll 2 dice, and they're going to add 4 for this air unit. They're going to add 4 for that air unit for a total of 8. And the Chinese are going to do the same, except that they're only going to add 3 for that air unit and 4 for that air unit. So the Chinese are at a very slight disadvantage, mathematically speaking. Okay, well, before we roll air combat, the player that initiated the engagement has the option to declare the use of cyber war if they want. So the Japanese player could apply a cyber war chit, and they have 2 chits to start with. And of course, what we want to do is we want to be able to get a strike in on this Chinese fleet, and we need to win air combat to do that. So yes, absolutely, we're going to apply one of our cyber war chits. Now you'll recall during the last Chinese replacement phase, I used 2 of my replacement points to buy cyber war chits. So the Chinese player has the option then to apply a cyber war chit if he wants. And yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do, because for the same reason, I have to protect this Chinese stack here. I can't let the Japanese get a strike in if I can do anything about it. Do note that participation in air combat does not preclude an air unit from conducting a strike in a hex. And some players may ask why that is so. The reason is because if you could do that, what you would have happening is you would have players sacrificing their low-quality air units, throwing them into air combat simply to disqualify the other player from conducting a strike, and I didn't want that happening, so that would never happen in real life. Well, alright, so if the Japanese win air combat, they're printed with the strike symbol, which is the triangle. That will allow them to actually conduct a strike on the Chinese stack here. So we, as the Chinese, do not want to let that happen. So we're going to throw down and put a cyber war chit in there as well. Let's go ahead and roll the dice and see what happens. We'll start with the Japanese die roll first. Well, look at that. The Japanese did not roll well at all. But nevertheless, let's go through the calculation. We got to roll a 3. And of course, we're adding 4, so that's 7. And then we've got another 4 for a total of 11. All right, we've got the cyber war chit, and that'll bump us up to a 12. So a 12 is actually a pretty respectable result, but that's only possible because we've got these 4 quality air units and of course the cyber war. So alright, well, things are not looking good for the Japanese to start off with. Let's go ahead and roll the Chinese and see how they do. See if they can beat a 3. Now they actually need at least a 4 because they've only got a 3 quality air unit as opposed to one of the Japanese 4 quality air units. Alright, well, the Chinese roll a 9 and they've clearly prevailed in air combat. So the first thing that happens is we expend the cyber war chits. Those are out. Okay, well, what happens when you win air combat? Well, the player that won air combat simply gets to decide which enemy air unit, one of the two, that he wants to eliminate. In this case, both Japanese air units are the same, so it doesn't matter. Still an unfortunate loss for the Japanese in any case, but the Japanese have lost one of their 4 quality air units, just simply shot down. The other air unit is aborted. We flip him to his flown side, and he flies back to base, and that allows the Chinese air units to reign supreme over the Hex. They have protected their fleet. However, they are also flown, and they are returned to base as well. In the case of the Chinese, they are returned to base off map. So there you go. We've got we've resolved the first strike attempt, and pretty risky in fact, but the Chinese managed to save themselves from being bombed. Okay, well, the next thing is the Japanese player has the option to conduct airstrikes against some of these Chinese land units here, depending on how many air units that the Japanese have available. Now, the Chinese actually have a pretty substantial air force. It's not as qualitative as the Japanese air force, but the Chinese have a lot of them. So what I don't want to have happen is I don't want to get into a bunch of air combats with the Chinese air force at this stage. What I'd rather do is try to wipe these Chinese units out via land combat. So that's going to end the strike phase for this turn, and in the next video what we'll do is we'll jump into the Japanese movement phase, and that'll be interesting because we're going to see some of these Japanese fleets come out, and we're going to see all the Japanese land units get moving. Now, I'm not going to walk you through the movement of every single land unit. I'm going to go ahead and do that off screen. I'll move all these Japanese land units, and in the next video they'll already kind of be deployed and in position, and we'll talk about anything that's relevant, and at that point we'll get into land combat, and we'll see how that goes.